Dear co-founder, I made this audio message for you. At this point, I will have had the great joy and opportunity to share with you my intention of forming a company together and sharing the ride of the coming adventure with you. This message is to honor the intention and say thank you in my own way and express my gratitude. I know we know each other very well, but I do not think I had the chance to attempt to express my thoughts before on the following subjects. Not to myself, nor to you. These thoughts are largely influences I have had over the years from writers and philosophers who made an impression on me, and at the same time I want to add to the message in my own way, as well as by sharing thoughts that I believe in. I'd like to make 10 points that can be relevant to the coming time that we want to spend with each other. So without further ado, allow me to get started. Point 1. Sailors and shipbuilders. At a party, I've been asked what notable figure of history I'd like to have dinner with. I knew the answer immediately. I said I want to have dinner with a shipbuilder who built the Santa Maria, which was the ship of Christopher Columbus on his journey from Europe to America. I'd be very interested to hear what the shipbuilder was thinking. Were they proud to work for such a cause? Was he fulfilled? While it is true that the captain will be responsible for the success of the trip, I believe that the shipbuilder has an equally important role in history, one that is essential to making a vision a reality. A shipbuilder takes responsibility, and I see my role similar to the shipbuilder's role. I cannot guarantee everything, and yet if I do my job well, the captain can take the boat beyond what one could have ever imagined. Point 2. Who is the captain?
For thousands and thousands of years, truth was established by the divine ruler or the tribal leader. And in the 17th century, plus or minus a few years in Western Europe, this kind of new idea spread. But instead of asking what was true and false, there was a universal truth that anybody could figure out through measurement and experiment. And that idea, now called the scientific method, changed the world more than any other idea. It essentially democratized truth.
The previous interlude revealed to me that truth-seeking is something that is democratized at this point. And that thought is empowering to me. As a physicist, I believe that I, too, can discover some truth about the world that can matter. My attention currently is focused on my own health condition, which is an autoimmune reaction from my body that creates blood glucose challenges. And the power to find truth and act on it that can make my condition better is something I believe is within me. And this individual agency over one's own health is a fundamental idea of empowerment and self-determination. And the captain, I believe he or she ought to be the most determined person on the boat to successfully complete the journey to the promised land. And he or she is the last to leave the ship if it were to sink, ensuring that all efforts to save others have been made before attempting to save themselves. This principle underscores the importance of leadership, responsibility, and sacrifice. So who would I take responsibility for and would I sacrifice for the most? Point 3. My family.
You seem to be good at many things, of course, just based on the bio alone. But what strikes me is how quickly you were able to develop expertise in new fields. And I'd like to use this as an opportunity to bring up what was mentioned at the very beginning of your bio, and that is United Therapeutics, a biotechnology company she started to save the life of one of her daughters. I'd love for you to provide some context for this and tell a bit of the story, just because people will want to hear it. And then the follow-up, just to plant the seed for it, is how you learned biology. Because my understanding is you didn't have much in terms of background in biology. That's a huge mouthful of a question, but if you could give us a bit of the background, that would be extremely helpful, and we can use that as a jumping off point.
Sure. So it's kind of funny that, you can go all the way through undergraduate at a great place like UCLA and never be required to take a life science course, but that was the case. So the last biology class I had was in high school. And here, suddenly, I was faced with a situation as an adult while running SiriusXM that our youngest daughter is diagnosed with a fatal illness. She can't even walk up a couple of stairs to the front door, and there are no medicines approved for it. I finally got her to the best doctor one could find, the head of pediatric cardiology at Children's National Medical Center in the middle of Washington, D.C. And the doctor said, this is an extremely rare disease. No one knows why it arises. All the patients die within 2 to 3 years. He had only seen 2 or 3 other kids with it, and they both died. And all you can do is hope for a lung transplant. So, Tim, I was completely crushed. I just saw black. I mean, I didn't know what to do. And the only thing I could think of doing while she was in the intensive care ward night after night, and myself and Bina would tag team staying there with her, was once she fell asleep to go down into the library and to just begin, learning about what was this illness she had, which they told me was called pulmonary arterial hypertension. And why were there no treatments available for it? So I just began reading and reading and reading. Most of the time I read things, I didn't understand what they were talking about because there were these long medical words and chemical words that I never learned in law school or we never had to deal with in electrical engineering. But of course, there were dictionaries, and I looked up the words in a dictionary. And they had college level anatomy textbooks. So what I didn't know, I just kept going backwards in academia, I guess you would say, backwards in learning or pedagogia, until I would even get to like a high school level textbook that would explain something. And I said, okay, I get that. And I kept taking notes and just educated myself night after night until I learned everything I needed to know.
How did you, and I know this is a story you've told before, but ultimately in searching for possible solutions, and as we were chatting about before recording, there's a lot of luck involved, and it doesn't mean that your path is replicable by any set of parents who are caught in a tragic situation similar to what you experienced. But nonetheless, you were able to ultimately track down, I suppose it's fair to say, a molecule, a drug of some type. Would you mind describing for listeners the process then of attempting to secure the ability to utilize in any fashion this drug or to license it? If you could describe that, I have a number of questions that'll stem off of it.
This previous interlude has been one that changed my mind about how I believe I can shape the future of my children when I will have them, and it really is a source of inspiration for me. I learned that it is a real gift to have this desire to help and be there in times of need for your children. Point 4. Education and religion.
What exactly a human being was and what counted as a human being was a much more open question. Okay, and of course, generally speaking, if you're talking about the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, a human is kind of part divine, part animal in some sense, right? That has always been kind of the classical metaphysical definition of the human, without talking about apes for the most part. So apes generally was not part of that discourse, that religious discourse, because there weren't that many apes around, especially in the European countries. And so So the human was this kind of metaphysical hybrid always.
This interlude reminds me of an essay I wrote for one of my courses at the University of Toronto. It was a course I got the highest mark in ever, so I was, and still am, really proud of it. I wrote about a belief in Judaism. It is called Tikkun Olam, and it is a belief that our world is currently imperfect, and that it is a God-given responsibility to make it better. My essay doesn't extend to Christianity, but as far as my understanding goes, this exists in that faith as well. Jesus had to carry the beam of his own cross, which represents the idea that one should carry the weight of their own mission that they are on. And many Christians believe that they too have their cross in their lives and should carry it for themselves. And there's also a faithful reassurance that God doesn't give you a heavier cross than the one that you can bear. In essence, you must realize you can rise to the challenge and succeed. So what is the challenge? Point 5. The challenge.
Trump in the last week has signed this right to try legislation, which actually allows people who have incurable diseases to be able to use various kinds of treatments that haven't yet been approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. And I take it you're very sympathetic to that.
Yes.
I mean, for those of you who don't know, I mean, this is quite interesting because this goes against the sort of precautionary aspect of government that has been very dominant for a long time. And so in a sense, Trump is kind of allowing the government to open up people to do stuff they weren't allowed to do previously.
Well, Steve, you and I have talked about this in the past, but there's always this precautionary principle that we have to be very scared about all the possible things that can happen, that can go wrong with technology, that can go wrong with experimental drugs or experimental medical treatments. And then I always think sort of the counterpoint to the precautionary principle. I think you have the proactionary principle, but sort of the counterpoint to it is always that we're not living in a perfect world. If we lived in a world where nobody ever got sick or died, maybe a precautionary principle would be a good thing. If we're living in a world with terrible, incurable diseases, maybe we want to actually disrupt that. We want to try some things that are very different. And so I think a lot of the, again, using conservatism in your sense, a lot of the sort of anti-technology, anti-science, we should not change the world. Everything is, it sort of has this implicit assumption that things are actually pretty good, that they're better than people think. And the assumption I have, and maybe the two of us have, is that things are actually a lot worse than people think. We don't realize how terrible it is to be sick.
I never talked about my struggle that my autoimmune condition poses to me. Perhaps it's time I share that with you now. Even though I consciously made the choice to show up with my best behavior, I can be challenged by an imbalance in physiological state. When I'm low, I can have double vision with the inability to see. When I'm low, I can have sunspots appear that can permanently damage my vision. When I'm low, my ears start ringing. It feels like as if this was a telephone call from the Grim Reaper who wants to take my life. Perhaps I liken it to the moment when J.K. Rowling describes what an encounter with a Dementor would be like. You can lose your consciousness and collapse. And it is hard for me to talk about this, but I wanted to share this with you because I believe you can help me. Point 6. Asking for help is a courageous act.
Makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. And on a related note in some respects, and this is a question that doesn't always work, so I'll take the blame if it doesn't. But if you had a billboard, metaphorically speaking, to get a message, a quote, a word, an image, a question, anything out to billions of people, let's just assume they all speak English for the sake of argument, what might you put on that billboard?
I think Apple Computer and Steve Jobs got there before me. Think different. Think different.
Why is that important?
Because the solutions, Albert Einstein said you can't solve a problem on the same level that it was created. You have to solve it on a different level. If we all think the exact same way, we will never get out of the ruts that we're in. The only way to get out of the problems that we face is to think differently, to go down the corridor of indifference, to question authority, to be diverse. Thinking different is the pathway to solving problems that exist today.
Looking back at everything we've talked about and looking at all of the copious pages of notes for prep in front of me, it strikes me that you've forged many paths for yourself and helped others to do the same by thinking different, but also thinking brightly, coming back to Alan Watts yet again, right? The yin and the yang, and seeing the positive, looking for the positive in different circumstances, different situations. Do you have any advice or recommendations for people who struggle to do that, who are maybe mired in a sense of hopelessness, might be too strong a word, but those who tend to see the glass as half full and perhaps as a result of that tend to see half the spectrum of options or solutions?
It's a really difficult question to answer, Tim, because everybody's situation is so unique and so different. And I do not doubt that for many, many people, it is just a bad life, whether it started that way or ended up the way, and it's almost impossible to see a way out. The perspective that I take is that I try to stay in touch with my ancestors. I think about the great-grandmothers who had to, bear children in the worst of possible circumstances. I think about, all of the, like my partner Bina's great-grandmothers who were picking cotton as slaves and had to work all day being bitten up by bugs, burning in the sun, feet deep in mud, and then bear a child at the last moment. So whether it's like, my great-grandparents from Eastern Europe or hers from the African diaspora, they had nothing to look forward to other than just the hope that they were going to have some children and that maybe those children might have a little bit of a better life than they did. And if not their children, their children's children. So their only purpose in life, their only hope in life, their only joy in life was to make a generation and that maybe that generation would be better. So I say to myself, and I would ask, somebody else looking through the world darkly right now, looking at the glass half full, I would say, how much worse it must have been in the past. What do I owe to my grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents who suffered and toiled, who barely managed to survive to produce another generation? What do I owe to them? I owe to them to make the absolute most possible out of my life, and that's what I'm going to do.
Hot damn, Martine. I'm ready to get out there and get amongst it. I have so enjoyed this conversation. There are 79 more hours we could do just in round one. I won't subject you to that. And I'm so grateful that you were willing to make the time to have this conversation.
After my time in Toronto, I returned to my home in Budapest and began to work on what I believe can help me prepare against my weaker moments and give me an understanding why these occur. Some would think my problem is a problem of biochemistry and that one should pursue a creation of a chemical solution, a solution that can stabilize both the lows and the highs for people with blood glucose challenges. Who am I to doubt that this too could be possible? But I truly believe that there could be other ways to solve this. Point 7. The bliss of inexperience. I've been given the advice by a company founder once that when I start recruiting friends and colleagues to join me on solving this problem, I should keep one thing in mind. Hire for potential, not for skills. Hire for potential, not for skills. And give everyone the right incentives, and they will amaze you by how fast they can pick up the right skills. In addition to this, the bliss of inexperience only opens up new perspectives and perhaps a healthy ignorance to the enormity of the task ahead.
So there's that. There's a beginning to be a kind of recognition within the law that our notions of personhood are morphing in response to the way in which the technology has a much more intimate kind of functioning in the way in which we define ourselves as human beings. So, but the point is, it's a very open space at the moment, and different courts rule differently in different countries. So this is not a done deal that, that cyborganization is going to become the norm. But it is interesting that the U.S. Supreme Court has already put a marker down in that direction.
Point 8. Computer-aided learning. We're living at a point in time in history where the mass adoption of artificial intelligence has begun and continues to be on the rise, with different services and products being at the center of this. I'm certainly a beneficiary of this because I have been using services like Find.com, Perplexity AI, and ChatGPT to learn how to create computer code and better visualize health data on the iPhone. In essence, I believe without this new way of product development, where one gets the helping hand of a computer system, I would have not been able to create the solution I have now. Certainly not this fast. And now that I have version 1 of my product, I'd like to raise capital to further refine it with the help of a co-founder. Point 9. Teamwork.
So when you bring a group of people together and you organize them and you set a mission and you tie a reward system, incentives tied to that mission, all of a sudden you create two forces. And here's what they are. The first one is stake and outcome. Think of that as equity. So let's say, to stick with our industry, you have a small biotech company and you're developing a new cancer drug. Your stake and outcome is your stake in that drug's success. Does it work or not? Now, when you're a small company, your stake and outcome is enormous. If the drug works, everybody's a hero and a millionaire. If the drug fails, everybody's unemployed.
Right.
What's the second force? It's perks of rank.
Interesting.
So you can think of this almost as equity in cash or equity in base salary. When you're a tiny, small company, stakes and outcome are so much bigger than perks of rank. Now let's flip it. Let's say you, Sonal, are a manager at Pfizer. So now let's look at your incentives. What's the stake and outcome? Well, if you make a good drug, let's say it sells $500 million a year. That's a pretty good drug. Plus, you're going to be fighting for the next 7 or 10 years. Everybody wants your budget, and there's going to be the 3 deaths with the loon shot. You're going to have to try to defend it. So your stake and outcome is pretty tiny. What's the perks of rank? Well, if there's a committee meeting and you sit around a table and keep, trashing these loon shots and doing it in a very thoughtful, wise, and maybe you're very funny and kind of witty, and they're like, well, this young person, she's got a great head on her shoulder.
She's aligned with our vision, right?
What might you get? Promoted.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then what happens when
it.
you're promoted? 30% bump in salary.
And not much change in stake and equity, actually.
Exactly. Yeah. So we just went from small, where a small company, stake and outcome was much bigger, perks of ranks were irrelevant, to large, where stakes and outcome is very small and perks of rank. So that's very much equivalent to the water.
These are the dynamic two forces that you're describing.
Right. And instead of temperature, it's size. So somewhere between small and large, as you grow and you grow and you grow, all of a sudden the balance of incentives suddenly shift.
To qualify for an investment, I must partner with someone. Not just anyone, but someone who I can trust, and in many aspects, with someone who is diligent and open to the idea of being a committed partner. I want him to be committed to the project and paint a better future for him where his hard work pays off and makes a difference in the quality of his life. For this reason, I like to ask, what would be the right expectation of your equity and ownership of this company? And how much do you think I should own? It is a question that can lead to potential conflict, but I'm hoping that we can find a resolution and a right split. Right now, I'd like to propose that you take 40% of the company and I take 60% of the company. I am aware that certain conditions need to be met, and we talked about the conditions before, but I want to reiterate. You are truly a unique supporter of a great cause. I can assure you that I will support you the same way you have supported me. The final point. Please do not cut ties with your current job. I'd like you to help me full-time with this project. And I also acknowledge that as I strive to support you and myself, the reality is that starting a company comes with many risks. I want you to always have that option to be able to go back and pick up from where you left off. Perhaps the day may come when we are both rewarded for our efforts, perhaps not. But I certainly do not want you to be penalized for helping a friend in times of need. I want you to know this. Perhaps we don't get the chance to help thousands. Perhaps we will. But the efforts you and I will have made is going to impact me and my family in a very meaningful way. And I'm very grateful for this. Thank you.